Apparently, writing has been a passion for Ruchir since high school. And this is actually his 2-year labor of love. And we'd like to congratulate him as the book has already climbed up to the New York Times bestseller list. This isn't the first time Ruchir's been at the FCC. He spoke previously about his earlier book. But the current book is about 10 rules to detect shifts in the political, economic, and social spheres. This is so timely in the wake of Brexit. Let's hear what he has to say. Everyone, please welcome to the stage Ruchir Sharma.
Thanks a lot. Delighted to be back here at the FCC after a 4-year gap. It was exactly at this time in 2012 that I was here. That was my first book. I'd been a writer before I was an investor. As I say even today that I invest for the dough and I write for the show. And that's something which is a real passion for me. Because I think that if it was the other way around, it would be trouble. My first book that I wrote was after a gap, after having already written in op-eds and editorials for about 20 years, which I started as a passion right out of high school. But like every writer, I thought that I had a book in me. As some wisecrack put it, that was the best place for it. But once the writing bug hits you and you start writing books, it's hard to stop. So here I am 4 years later with a bigger passion project on the rise and fall of nations. The basic thesis of this book is that everything that we believed in about the world last decade has been turned on its head. So in fact, I start off by splitting the book into 2 segments, the BC and the AC era, the BC being before the crisis and AC being after the crisis. Because if you look at the trends after the crisis of the 2008 financial crisis, they're just so different in many ways, and explain why events such as Brexit are happening now. So look at some of the big trends that have come to define the world in the so-called AC era. One of them is that there's a huge anti-establishment wave sweeping the world. So what we do is to track the popularity ratings of the leaders in the world's 20 largest countries. And that's been showing a steady decline since 2010 or so. And today is at an all-time low. The popularity or approval ratings of the leaders of the 20 largest countries that we have data for. So there's a massive anti-establishment wave running through the world. And this is not ideological. It's popular to speak about this wave as being a sort of revolt against the policies of the last few decades and stuff like that. But it's quite varied. It's popular to think that populism is on the rise in Europe and in America, which is all true. And so that's what's giving rise to such an anti-establishment mood. But then the antidote to that is Latin America. And Latin America, if you see what's happening, it's exactly the opposite of what's happening in Europe and in America, where there's a huge anti-establishment wave, but it just so happens that the establishment in Latin America was entirely left-wing. And the people coming to power in Latin America are all the so-called neoliberal, market-friendly people that we have come to deride so much in many parts of the world. So really what's going on is that there's a massive anti-establishment wave, and whoever is in power is getting sort of swept out. And I feel that in some way the Brexit vote got caught up in that. It was as much an anti-establishment statement as it was a statement about what really is about the core issues which are going on in UK. So in fact, if you look at it last decade, 2 out of 3 incumbents across the world were winning their re-election bid. Now that number is down to 1 in 3 by last year. So all part of an anti-establishment wave. Having said that, there is clearly a move towards deglobalization. And this is playing out in many ways. One, that global trade volumes have collapsed. for the first time in history, global trade volumes today are contracting outside of the global economy being in a recession. The number of protectionist measures that countries are taking across the world have increased sharply and in strange places. I've just come from India, and India is at the forefront of this, where no other country has taken as many protectionist measures this decade as India. But cumulatively, the number of protectionist measures that countries are taking across the world have gone up significantly this decade, again, a feature of the AC era. The other feature is that of deglobalization is a collapse in capital flows, which is that the biggest lenders across borders over the last 2 decades were banks. Banks sort of increasing their lending across borders, and that went up in a very major way last decade, and those flows have collapsed this decade. So that's all part of the deglobalization theme which is playing out. And of course, the third one, which has sort of risen a lot in people's consciousness, is income inequality. That has risen very significantly over the last few years. I mean, one statistic which sort of still surprises me is that there were about 1,000 billionaires in the world at the turn of this decade. Today, there are nearly 2,000. So at a time when we have seen one of the weakest economic recoveries in history, an explosion of wealth at the top, and the number of billionaires at the top just sort of is representative of that. So these are some of the big trends which are playing out, and possibly Brexit was a manifestation of these trends, of these ongoing trends. So that's how I sort of set the scene, like even in the book, that this is a world of impermanence. Everything that we believed in last decade has been turned on its head, and these trends are likely to continue to evolve as we go along. The other thing which I'm very clear about is that as a practitioner, to be very realistic about time horizons, because I find that the old rule of forecasting used to be that you make as many forecasts as possible and you keep reminding people when you're right. The new rule of forecasting, which sort of came about last decade, was that you forecast so long out in the future that neither you nor I will be here to know whether I was right or wrong. So therefore, one thing which I'm very conscious about is do not make too long-term forecasts. In fact, in their book, Super Forecasters, people like Philip Tetlock have shown scientifically that the longer you forecast, the greater you are prone to make errors, just because there are so many unforeseen events which come about. In fact, I think his thing is that anything beyond 5 years is like pretty much pointless. So my forecast horizon about what's going to happen and which countries will do well, and the rules which have come up with the 10 rules are geared for that sort of time horizon, which is the next 5 years or so, at best up to a decade. Now, if I look at really what are the 10 most important things to look at, what I've tried to do here is to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff, which is that there are so many things that we are told which a country should focus on. It should be education, it should be healthcare, it should be the competitiveness index, the ease of doing business index. And my entire sort of attempt has been, okay, let's test all these things. Let's see which ones have worked and which have not. And there are some surprising results. For example, I find that education is not a relevant metric in predicting whether a nation will do well or not for the next 5 or 10 years. Of course, education matters. That's a bit of a motherhood statement. But it's basically the fact that by the time you make changes in the education system and they have any impact on growth, it takes many decades, 30, 40, 50 years. And possibly there's a bit of a chicken egg story, as we saw with Korea, Taiwan, and even in China, that often the improvement first comes in terms of the jobs created for the uneducated, low-skilled workers in manufacturing. And once that money flow is created, or the state has the money to spend, that's when the education systems get built. So it's very hard to know as to which one comes first. But more importantly, the significance of this is that any improvements in education have an impact on economic growth with a time lag of about of many decades, maybe 5, 6 decades or something like that. So the entire process here was to eliminate as to what works and what does not work in coming up with these 10 most important rules, along with a conclusion as to which countries today rank as good, average, and ugly based on these 10 rules. The the first rule for me was, like when I first started writing the book, I was not sure that this was going to be my first rule, but its significance kept increasing over time, and so therefore I put it as my first rule, which is people matter. And what do I really mean by this? That one of the single biggest trend changes over the last decade has been what's happening to the world's population growth rate, especially the world's working age population growth rate. And this has got nothing to do with the 2008 financial crisis, but it just is sheer coincidence that just before the 2008 financial crisis, some very significant changes began to happen with the world's population growth rate, particularly the working age population growth rate. And what do I mean by this? Which is that for much of post-war history, the world's working age population was growing at about just over 2%. And after about 2005, that rate has collapsed, and now it stands at just 1%. Now, this is huge. Why is it huge? Because there are two drivers of economic growth in any country. One is productivity, and the second is the increase in the country's labor force. And what we have seen is that the decline which is taking place in the working age population is now a major headwind to growth, or at least that you can't get the same growth with fewer workers. One stunning statistic here, that there are about 35 countries in the world today where the working age population is actually shrinking. In the 1980s, that number was just 2. There were just 1 or 2 countries in the world, like a small Hungary or something, where the working age population of a nation was shrinking. Now, we have the case of China, that last year was the first time in China's recent history that its working age population actually shrank. And what our work shows is that when a country's working age population is shrinking, the average growth rate that country is able to generate is just 1.5% over any decade. So that's like a really stunning result. It's an equal measure, which is that a country's growth rate is driven equally by productivity and an increase in the working age population growth rate. So this is a huge trend shift which is happening across the world, and China is at the forefront of this major trend shift. And so therefore, I've been in the camp which believes that a 6% type growth target in China is extremely unrealistic at a time, if nothing else, when your working age population is shrinking. Now, of course, they're changing their policies, a second child, towards encouraging a second child and stuff. But again, the time lag it takes before that policy begins to have any effect on economic growth will be very long, at least 10 to 20 years or so, even if they're able to move the needle by a change in their policy. So that's a huge significant shift. As I say in the book, that demographics is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for high economic growth, which is if you have good demographics, that leads to high economic growth. If you don't have good demographics, you can't get high economic growth. But of course, you have to convert it. Now, coming back to the UK, look at what was happening in the UK. If you look at the domestic population growth, like in UK, that is basically close to zero. In fact, it's just 0.2% or so. It was really immigration which was helping increase UK's working age population growth rate to about 1.4% a year. And if you look at the difference in economic growth rates between US, Japan, Europe, the single biggest explanatory factor has been the change in demographics of working age population. In Japan's case, I think that's well known by now, that we keep speaking about Japan and throwing our hands up, that why can't this country, get its act together? Why can't it grow very rapidly? But the fact of the matter is, when your working age population is shrinking, it is very difficult to grow. So in fact, in Japan's case, what we see today is that their economic growth rate has been as low as 0.5 to 1%, and yet they're facing acute labor shortages. So that's, and the other sort of thing I hear about a lot is the fear of robots, artificial intelligence. What is this going to do? Well, my sort of favorite line here is that the robots are coming just in time to help, right? So if you look at what's happening in, where is the robot population increasing most significantly? Germany, South Korea, Japan, and even now China is moving that up very significantly, because in all these countries, the populations are aging and the birth rates have been declining. So these are countries which need the help of robots. So I see them more as complementing economic growth rather than the entire fear that they're going to replace whatever wild statistics we have heard, 40% of the world's workforce or something like that. I think that's a major trend shift again taking place with the robots more sort of supplementing rather than, complementing rather than supplementing jobs in the world. So that's the first thing. The second rule I speak about is the circle of life. And here, if you look at it, there are about 200 countries in the world today. Of the 200, only 35 are classified as developed. The rest are all classified as emerging, and many of them, from Brazil to Mexico, have been emerging forever, right? So if you look at Brazil's history, last 100 years, Brazil today is as poor relative to the United States as it was 100 years ago. All that happens in Brazil is that when commodity prices go up, they look like a superstar, and when commodity prices fall flat, they look like a basket case, which is what has been the case over the past couple of years. But Brazil has made no incremental progress as far as its economy is concerned, really for the last 100 years, because it is very commodity dependent. And that's the other general rule that I have, that the more commodity dependent an economy, the poorer its long-term growth prospects, and the more the focus on manufacturing and the success in manufacturing, the better it is for an economy. But the other reason why economies like Brazil get stuck is because they're caught up in what I call a circle of life, which is that when the economies are in crisis, it's only then that the leaders carry out economic reform or have the political backing to do it. Once they carry out economic reform, it leads to some economic boom. The moment you have a boom, it leads to complacency, and the complacency then sows the seeds for the next economic crisis. So in fact, one of the fascinating pieces of research that we came across on while doing this book was on the circle of life, was the fact that the longer a leader stays in office, the worse it is for a country. And the way that I began this rule, or each chapter really, is that it's sort of, I go back to when did I learn this rule? When did it strike me that this rule is relevant? And as far as the circle of life rule is concerned, that sort of penny dropped when I was in Russia, having tracked how Putin has sort of evolved over time. I use these words carefully because I think that the Putin of 2000 and 2001 that we knew was very different than the Putin I met in 2010. When Putin first came to power, he was a reformer. He wanted to, or he spoke at least, and he did, introduce a flat tax, spoke about keeping the government out of businesses apart from a few key natural resource sectors, and about making Russia much more like Europe. That was his initial talk, and he did deliver a lot on that. Fast forward to 2010, and here's what happens, which is that this is about October 2010. I'm going to attend a conference in Moscow, and the conference organizers call me up and say that the Prime Minister's office is very keen that since he will be there, Putin will be attending, will you make a presentation on what your frank thoughts are about Russia? So I said, yeah, sure. I mean, I'd be happy to do that if Putin's there, and be happy to see him and to make this presentation. So I prepared a very frank presentation on what I thought of Russia. And I landed up in Moscow to make this presentation in the autumn of 2010. And there was a stage, and there was Putin was sitting there, and there was Christine Lagarde, and I was there. She was then the French finance minister. And I got started on my presentation. And I started my presentation by saying that, when you came to power in 2000, the country was in a complete mess. There was total chaos out here, and and you did X, Y, Z, and the country's improved after that. But in 2010, the problem is that this country basically is still extremely dependent on oil. You're losing your budget discipline. There are no small and medium-sized enterprises in Russia compared to other countries, which have been the sort of lifeblood of economies like Korea and Taiwan as they have become miracle economies, and crony capitalism is rampant. So I took the advice very seriously of making a frank presentation, and I did. What I did not know was that it was being telecast live across the nation, because Putin was there and stuff like that. I thought it went okay because I finished my talk. I went and sat down. Christine Lagarde was looking a bit uncomfortable on stage. But then Putin out there basically came to speak. He acknowledged a couple of the points and stuff like that, and we all went home after that. The next morning, I was woken up by my office saying that, do you know what you have done? So I'm saying, I do not know what I've done. They said, haven't you read the morning's press? I said, I do not read Russian, so what is the matter? So they said that the entire Kremlin back press, as it is out there, has really gone after me by saying that you've come here, you've spoiled the party, who needs your money? This was 2010 when the price of oil was $100 a barrel. It all appeared as if this was unnecessary and gratuitous advice that I was giving and stuff, and stuff like that. And of course, I left Moscow that day and I haven't gone back because I just think that it's like dangerous to go back. But that's when the penny dropped that the Putin that we knew in 2000, 2001 was very different from the Putin of 2010. So he started out as a reformer, but he became, was very different. And the number of stale leaders in emerging markets kept piling up. The same thing with Erdogan. In terms of how he was, in his first term, I would say that Erdogan was possibly one of the biggest reformers in emerging markets in the recent times, if you look at his track record. But the Erdogan of today is very different, much more meddlesome and all sorts of personal allegations swirling around him there. So that was the entire point. The longer a leader stays in office, the worse it is for that country. And then we statistically proved it in a very narrow way using the stock market as a proxy. And the results were quite staggering. What we found in emerging markets was that 90% of the outperformance of a stock market typically comes in the first 2 years of a new leader. And after that, you have diminishing returns to par, which is the longer you stay, the leader stays in power, the less the returns. And then by the third term, God forbid if they stay, then it totally tails off. So that was the rule about the circle of life. Then the other sort of interesting rule, which was recently I had to come up with, was to deal with the question of income inequality. This is not something that people were used to looking at to evaluate the rise and fall of nations a decade ago. And the problem with income inequality, that's a very subjective thing. What are you looking for? What I'm looking for is a nation getting close to that tipping point where the masses turn hostile towards a country's wealth creation, that they turn hostile towards the fact that there are few people who are gaining at the top and they're not gaining, so it leads to populist upsurges in nations. So how do you gauge that? You can talk to people in a country, but how do you gauge that? And we found that all these economic measures like Gini coefficients, etc., were all really outdated. You have to look at this stuff from a very sort of real-time basis because that data is extremely old. So we decided to have a look then at things like good and bad billionaires in a country, which is that if a nation that there are three ways of looking at it. One, if a nation has too many billionaires as a share of its economy, that the economy is a bit sort of bloated at the top. Two, that if a nation has too many inherited billionaires, now every nation will have some inherited billionaires, but if a nation has far too many inherited billionaires, well above the global average, that economy is out of balance. And the third thing I look at is good and bad billionaires, which is that from which industries is the wealth being created? Is it from industries such as technology, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, which consumers benefit from, which they sort of think that that this wealth is being created legitimately because of the good work that these people are doing in innovation, or is it in industries such as mining, oil, and other things, or even real estate, where the perception is that a lot of the wealth is created if you end up getting the right government connections and the right contracts. So this is not the idea that everyone's good or bad in these industries, but one about balance. And sure enough, the country which is most out of balance on this is a country like Russia, where you have far too much wealth from such industries, and also the share is very large. But it's like other countries, the results are mixed, but they all tell you about a nation. Like in Japan, the problem is the opposite. It has the lowest share of billionaires in the world as a share of its economy. Just tells you that beyond a point in Japan, it is tough to make too much wealth. So I look at the averages across nations and see where nations really are out of balance. But income inequality is something that has increased significantly as a factor out there. So similarly, I've come up with these sort of 10 rules, and I don't want to give everyone all these rules away lest you don't go buy the book, but I just thought that I would at least sort of showcase some of this and very briefly then sort of tell you as to that if I were to rank these rules, how do which nations really look good, average, and ugly, and then open it up to Q&A. So very briefly, I'd like to summarize the other rules which are here. I have an entire rule on the perils of the state, which is that the state being too meddlesome or not. Then there are some hardcore economic rules based on things like cheap is good, which is the fact that if a currency feels cheap, that a developing nation typically needs a cheap currency to try and grow, cheap and stable. China, Korea, Taiwan all showed the way. So where does this feel cheap and expensive? If you're going to Brazil and Russia and paying $1,000 a night for room nights, as we were at the beginning of this decade, you knew something is wrong with this economy and it's terribly uncompetitive. The other myths which I sort of really expose in the book, I think, is the fact that inflation, that most people in countries such as India, Brazil, etc., came to believe that if inflation is rising, it's a sign of strong, like in the economy. Quite the opposite, that economies which boom on a sustainable basis typically have very low inflation because investment tends to be very high. And we saw that again in China, Korea, Taiwan as examples. So there's a whole rule on inflation and on investment as well. What's the sweet spot for investment as well? And the one other rule, which is of course like a bit something which is provocative, is the kiss of death. And of all the rules that I studied, I found that it's all about probabilities rather than certainties, that no one rule can explain if a nation is going to rise and fall. You have to look at all the 10 rules as a composite, that, okay, what do all the 10 rules do? Because often we tend to get caught up with one rule. If you don't like a leader of a country, we tend to base our judgment just on that. But my point is that look at all the 10 rules and look at where nations stand. But if there's one rule where I found the statistical significance to be extremely high, it was on the kiss of death. And what do I mean by that? Which is that when, if a country's debt increases very rapidly over a short span of time, that is the single best predictor of both sharp economic slowdowns and financial crises. So in fact, we came up with a threshold level, that what is that level? And the level I came up with was that if a country's debt increased by more than 40 percentage points of the share of its economy over a 5-year time horizon, that nation would definitely face a massive economic slowdown like in the next 5 years, and a 70% risk of a financial crisis, about 2/3 risk of a financial crisis in the next 5 years, because you're just borrowing from the future from now. So that's what makes me cautious about China as well, because the increase in China's debt as a share of its economy has been well above that 40 percentage point threshold in the last 5 to 7 years. And this was not the case during the first 30 years of China's development. They never had such a big spike in its debt. So that's the big change in China's future, according to me. And the last rule, and this is going to be particularly controversial given that I have a lot of journalist friends out here, has to do with the curse of the cover story, which is that as a writer myself, I'd heard about this curse of the cover story. But I said, what does it really mean? So we decided like to test this, what does it mean? And the conclusion we reached is that if a trend makes it, if a country makes it to the cover of a magazine such as Time, like in a good way, then 2/3 of the time of the next 5 years that country does poorly. On the other hand, if like it makes it to the cover of Time in a negative way, then for the next 5 years, it typically does well. So which really means is that this growth is very hard to sustain, and by the time a popular magazine recognizes that trend, it is almost too late. And there's a feedback loop as well, that once a nation or leader makes to the cover of these magazines, then there's a tendency for the nation to be rather complacent in terms of how the leader is and how even the public are in terms of carrying out more reforms. And so therefore that short circuits the process. So those are basically my 10 rules, and I'm going to sort of now shut up because I'm being told by the convener that my time is out. And with this, I'd love to open it up to the floor for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If anybody has questions, would you like to raise your hands? A mic will go to you. Please identify yourself and the organization that you are with. I see a gentleman back there.
Jürgen Kracht, you mentioned your trip to Moscow. Can you tell us a bit about your trip to Beijing? How was that? And secondly, what recommendation do you have for China, for the development?
One thing I'll say, and maybe I'm saying this too prematurely, is that I really find that in China, it's a much more open and willing society to listen to economic criticism. I think the sensitivity is regarding political criticism. But on things like economics, I think that it's relatively more open. I was last in Beijing in April of this year. And I think that, again, like my views on this have been like a bit public for whatever it's worth. I've written tons of editorials for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal on this topic of debt and why China can't grow at 6% anymore based on demographics and other global things. And I've not found any, so far, touch wood, any great sort of, I mean, there's always some pushback, but there's no sort of fear like I would have, let's say, of a Moscow. But what does strike me, I mean, you asked me about a last trip to Beijing, is this addiction to debt. And that really is a bit sort of worrisome to me, which is that today it's taking $6 of debt to create $1 of GDP growth in China. At the peak of the US housing bubble in 2008, it was taking $3 of debt to create $1 of growth in the United States. So now, of course, I mean, the entire comeback is that this situation can be protracted for a long period of time because the entire debt is domestically held and it's state-owned, so you can keep passing the parcel without anyone really calling the debt. But it still sort of is a big headwind to growth because it chokes the banking system with a lot of bad debt. So I think that is my view, and I really feel that the Chinese leadership is aware of it, but I feel they don't know how to get off it. So because every time they sort of reduce the amount of credit offtake in the economy just slumps even more. So as I said, that if you look at China's growth trajectory this decade, it's really like a ping pong ball bouncing down the stairs, which is that the trend is down, but every time growth seems to be slowing down too much, they put in more stimulus. So you get a temporary spike, but less and less, and then the growth heads down again. So I think these are some very structural factors which are at work, and I just feel that those factors have not been recognized in the AC world in China, and the growth target is unrealistic, which is that it's very hard to grow, as I said, at 6% plus when you have a working age population that's shrinking, and there's only that far that debt can take you. But having said that, I've so far expressed these views, and I think that they're quite willing to listen to these kind of views.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Hello, Tom Holland, Gavkal Research. Ruchir, in your previous book, you looked around the various emerging markets and were fairly downbeat, but when it came to India, you gave India roughly a 50-50 chance of success, if I remember right. How would you rate India now? How would you rate Narendra Modi's government? Sort of marks out of 10.
Right. Like about India, as you will recall from the previous book, I had some very strong views about many countries, and India was 50-50 because my history with India, having looked at it closely, is that this is a country that's consistently disappointed the optimists and the pessimists. Right? That's the long history of India. I mean, that's the history of India. So I think the same thing has happened as far as Narendra Modi is concerned, which is that I'd say that his first, that the amount of political capital he had, there's so much that could have been done in the first 6 to 12 months. The biggest thing that some of us were writing about was particularly about cleaning up the public banking sector system. Like it's rather strange. There is no country in the world where the public sector's involvement in the banking system is as large as India. Maybe say for a North Korea or something, but like more than 70% of the banking assets in India are owned by the public sector. And that's twice or more than twice as high as the emerging market average. So that to me is something which should have been, as an example of what could have happened. There's a lot more that could have happened. Having said that, at a time when populism is on the increase in the world, the fact that at least some incremental reform is going on in India is something that I'll take. They're doing something to liberalize FDI and other things. So, as I said, that on India, I find, when I wrote the first book, I wrote it in 2011. At that point in time, expectations out of India were sky high, if you recall. It was all about 8-9% baseline growth and stuff like that. So I think that those expectations have now corrected a bit, but still, how much was expected out of Modi and what he's delivered is slightly underwhelming. But at a time when populism is on the increase, the fact that some incremental reforms going on, I'll take. But if I rank the 10 rules on India today, on average, I still put it in the good camp.
Any more questions? Gentleman at the back.
Robin Wong. I just wondered, as an investor, right? I mean, based on your rules of 10, which are the few countries which you are most optimistic? And
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like the 10 rule, I'd say the countries I'm most optimistic in the developed world are still United States and Germany. I think they rank pretty well on the scores. I'm relatively optimistic on South Asia as a region, not just India. I think that some of the other economies in South Asia too are beginning to do better. Bangladesh is doing relatively well because of its manufactured exports. I mean, the headlines are terrible in terms of what happens at with the labor or with the terror attacks and stuff like that. And the classic case that Pakistan was on the cover story of magazines as the most dangerous place on earth, 4 to 5. And I feel that even in Pakistan, we're beginning to see some improvement after the massacre of the children, which took place in end 2014. They've decided at least to start cleaning up their homegrown terrorist threat. And we're seeing a pickup in investment and in consumption, so I feel okay. And in this region, I think that Philippines is still a good turnaround story. I think that that still has some years to run. I feel that Indonesia is beginning to make the right sort of corrective steps to sort of do better. I think Vietnam is benefiting a lot from the fact that China is losing market share in the low end manufactured of goods. So that's something which should drive it. And lastly, if people ask me that which of the middle income economies in the world today do I think have the best chance of making it to the developed countries? And my best bet there is Eastern Europe. I think that they're in the sweet spot where they don't have the common currency, but yet they're part of a customs union and they have followed many of the institutional practices of Western Europe. So I feel that those economies are also very competitive with a very cheap exchange rate. And so those have the best chance, like Poland, Czech, Romania, of making it to developed world status in the foreseeable future.
Any more questions? Oh, I see a man there.
Thanks. Peter Thalasson from Reuters Breaking Views. I just wonder how much this whole framework depends on the assumption that countries, and particularly voters, will broadly act in their economic self-interest, and to what extent what we saw in the UK 10 days ago makes you think that that might not always be the case.
Well, I take that into account because, as I said, when I'm ranking countries, I'm doing it on basis of income inequality. I'm doing it on basis of like politics. So I'm very well aware that voters, like for example, who are the leaders today who are being able to defy this anti-establishment trend? It's not leaders where the economies are doing well necessarily. It's leaders which are being able to invoke nationalism, like Russia, like Turkey. So I totally take that into account, which is income inequality. We know that the moment you begin to sort of your policies turn towards much more towards redistribution, it is not that then rather than growing the pie, it begins to sort of hurt the process of economic growth, even if it's fine. And that's what people want. So I totally take that into account. My entire system here is designed to take into account the political economy. So they don't, and I think that voters may not act in their self-interest, and that's something which I have these rules to basically take that into account. So both income inequality and the circle of life rule on politics exactly point in that direction.
Any more questions?
I'm To Han Shi, a reporter from MLEX. I come from Singapore, and you talk about the cycle of life of politicians, saying that if a politician stays too many years, the return to the stock market goes down. In Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew had been in power for 30 years, and his son Lee Hsien Loong is now the prime minister for 10 years. So do you have any comment on the Singapore stock market, the Singapore economy, and the Singapore state investment companies?
Right. As I said, so that my entire system is based on probabilities, not certainties, right? So Lee Kuan Yew was there for 27 years, and people will, everyone from Putin to Erdogan supporters will point to a Lee Kuan Yew as a sort of exception. See what Lee Kuan Yew did, and so can these leaders. And my point is, there'll always be an exception. There's no rule I can make which is airtight to cover all the exceptions. It's about probabilities. If I get more than 2/3 probability on something, I'll take it. So I think the same thing in Singapore, which is that it's really been exceptional, maybe because of the size of the economy and the country, that it can be run a bit differently. But as I said, there are exceptions to the rule, and I would count Singapore as among the exceptions to that rule. But as I said, there's no rule which should be 100%. That is just impossible for me to get. Apart from, as I said, the kiss of death was the only place but I got a 100% probability result.
Any more questions? Ooh, right at the back, and then you.
I have a mic already,
Sorry,
so
sure, sir.
don't give a radio broadcaster a mic. You didn't mention much about immigration, other than in a tangential case or sense, in saying that falling birth rates matter. What about cultural attitudes toward immigration? How much does that matter for your calculus?
No, absolutely. So, I mean, this goes back to the point that you were earlier asking, that how much do I take into account the political economy? Mine is not to say what is right and wrong, but to say as to which countries will rise and fall. So, immigration, countries which have relied more on immigration have done well, better economically from a statistical standpoint, from Canada to Australia. But to the extent that it tears the social fabric of a country is something we have to look out for. So my point is not that you should have unbridled immigration. I'm only looking to see as to which countries are encouraging it and which countries are discouraging it, to offset what is very clearly a demographic headwind. So when I score UK on the rules, the one rule where UK was scoring relatively well before the Brexit vote was on the demographic rule. As I said, that UK's working age population was increasing by 1.4% a year, which was the same as the United States, which is seen as the land of immigrants and stuff. And those are very high numbers for a developed country in today's demographically challenged world. But if UK is going to shut the door, as it seems to be increasingly, on like immigration, that's going to knock off possibly up to a percentage point of its trend growth rate. That's huge, I think. And it sort of diminishes UK's role in the rest of the world by having a smaller economy, even if its per capita income is not that affected by less immigration. So I think that's the point, that I do take into account these political economy factors, and immigration can tear the social fabric of a country. There's no doubt about that. But UK seemed to be doing well and it was offsetting its very weak organic growth rate in its population otherwise.
Last question. Yeah.
This is with MLEX also. With regards to the idea of the nation or the nation state, and especially as we saw with Brexit recently, there's a tremendous tendency towards, as you mentioned, more separate, independence. What would be your view? Would that lead to some sort of similar sort of breakups, or in other unions, like countries like India, for instance? There's a lot of different regions that are actually looking forward for more independence, and even closer to Hong Kong, the ASEAN region, for instance. So that's my first question. And second, in your thesis about the countries and their stability, I'm quite curious, especially concerned, given your background as an investor, about the capital flows. How have you actually factored that into your sort of thesis? The tremendous sort of volatility in the markets, often caused by the portfolio investors, and how much weight have you given in your thesis with regards to the capital account liberalization, for instance? Thank you.
Great. So on the first question, since you raised the example of India, I'd say that it's a very interesting example, because in India, if you look at its post-independence history, the conclusion is clear that the more centralized the power, the greater the chance of a breakup. And the more federal the structure, the greater the chance of the country remaining together. So the country faced the maximum secessionist movements in the 1980s as a fallout often of what happened in the 1970s of increasingly dictatorial and centralization of power. Today in India, I think that if you look at the secessionist movements in general, they're possibly at an all-time low. There's still some rumblings here, there, and the other, but it's like an all-time low because the federal nature of the country, has increased. That much more freedom has been given to the states. So I think that's a lesson, that the more federal a country, the better the chance of it remaining united, and the more centralized it is in terms of the power and the control, the less the chance of it remaining united. That's one conclusion that I try and reach, as we know that one of the pro-arguments for leaving EU for Britain was exactly that there was too much concentration of power by Brussels, and 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 what was going on. Although I'm not sure how much a factor that actually played, but that was one of the arguments that was given there. So I think that's my conclusion as far as countries remaining together or falling apart. Regarding the other point, I think it's an interesting point because one of the issues I deal with, like in the book, is that in an era of deglobalization, countries just cannot be that dependent on foreign capital anymore. For example, like a technical rule that I used to have was that a country, the threshold for running a current account deficit was about 5% of GDP. That if it was more than that, a country would get into trouble. Less than that, possibly not. Now I'm saying that the threshold needs to be lowered to possibly just 3% of GDP, which is that it's very hard to sustain capital flows at a very robust pace. So you cannot rely on external capital to fund your growth as much as you could at one point in time. And this again is the main reason why I think we've seen such a sharp correction in sterling. One thing people forget is that this is not just about the Brexit vote. Before the Brexit vote happened, UK had the largest current account deficit of any country in the world, practically, at well above 5% of GDP. But that was being well funded by capital flows. But with that risk now, that that the capital flows may not be that friendly in this new environment, we've seen like sterling correct and will possibly have to remain cheap for longer to try and correct the fact that the current account deficit is so big. So that's the way that we are adjusting. That in a world of deglobalization, much lower threshold for your current account deficits and how much foreign funding can fund your growth.
Thank you very much. That was a very riveting talk. Thank you, Ruchir.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.